Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. The transition team for President-elect Donald Trump has said it will deliver on the former president's promises regarding sweeping changes to the nation's educational system and federal agencies. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, last week we talked some about the bigger promises and trends in education in this election, especially this idea of abolishing the Department of Education, which many scholars have argued likely couldn't be done without congressional approval, as well as school choice, which saw some mixed results in elections across the country. But Trump's team continues to promise they will deliver on education. What policies and ideas has Trump laid out on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And specifically, too, the Trump transition team they said basically they called it a resounding margin that Trump won by, and basically said that they gave him a mandate to implement the promises he made on the campaign trail. And then said, he will deliver these promises. So kind of a broad statement, but, very bold. And I think that's pretty reminiscent of a lot of the kinds of promises that we heard from Donald Trump throughout the campaign on education issues. And so it's what he's said is, he's listed out a number of different, positions. And as you mentioned, we talked about abolishing the Department of Education, eliminating it, and then also, implementing pretty broad school choice measures, federally. But there's also, some of those smaller things too. And I think it's helpful to drill into, there is some stuff that is not going to be so difficult to try to implement or, so landscape altering, but still of importance. And a lot of it too, I think, is maybe more that local or even classroom level interaction between students and teachers, or how things are run. I think it might be helpful to just kind of read off some of the key ideas. In 2023, there was a video that the campaign put out, and essentially had a lot of these kinds of promises that he was talking about. And one of the top in that video was putting the rights of parents first, and that's something that Republican states have seen a groundswell of support for. Right, we've seen parental rights legislation in a number of red-leaning states, and so I think that's going to be a big priority of putting that first. And we've also seen, I think, a lot from the COVID-19 era. Parents wanted to be in control of their kids' education. They were opposed to some of this, policies from school districts, but also, some of the state level stuff, and wanted to be involved in their children's education. The second one was empowering parents and school boards to hire principals and teachers, and then fire those who are not doing a good job. That you might remember, I believe we talked about this in Michigan. There is legislation there that makes it a little bit more difficult to fire teachers. It just kind of moves their performance around a little bit. So that might be one way to do it, is sort of have this is a codified performance metric for teachers. Focus on, reading, writing, math, science. That's a little bit harder to implement, I think, just because it's really broad. You're also, it's kind of hard if you don't have a Department of Education. How do you sort of implement some of these top-down changes? I think that some of these might be, a little bit contradictory, or maybe have some of these different kinds of strings attached to them. Like, how do you make sure that schools are doing that? Unless you're kind of leveraging something, it just might, some of the stuff needs to be maybe drilled into a little bit more. So, some political statements too. A lot of that is bringing prayer to our schools, teaching students to love their country. Some of those are, it's kind of intangible, right? Of how do you require that the 10 Commandments are in classrooms, like we've seen in Louisiana, and there's, the legal challenges there. It's some of these broader questions. And, another one too is that schools are safe, secure, and drug-free, with immediate expulsion for any student who harms a teacher or another student. So, that one is kind of clear there, of going back to a zero tolerance, which there's been a lot of backlash to that in recent years. I've written about restorative justice sort of as an answer to these zero tolerance policies. But I think that there might be some teachers out there who might be excited about some of these changes, given some of the climate in school, classrooms where things are contentious, and even at some point we have seen reports of students becoming violent. So it's, that might change things. And then school choice, again, we've talked about that before. That's rather broad. But then also project-based learning experiences. That's one that he talked about in 2023 here. Help train students for internships, and then also the career counseling. So like these are things that I think would be fairly easy to implement. Like that one would be fairly easy to implement at a local level of like having a designated career counselor to help students, walk through the process of finding a job or going to a institute of higher education. So I think that, there are some of these are smaller and I think maybe more manageable. So it'll be interesting to see like how much, and again, it's like, what do you get from the campaign promises? Like how much do you get back there? As we mentioned last time, we've heard, a lot of GOP presidents saying we're going to abolish the Department of Education. It's still kicking. So it's kind of a question of like, how much will is behind these.
As you mentioned, school choice is kind of a big piece of this puzzle. It's one of the ones that gets the most press and people talk about a lot. But some are saying voters in this election rejected school choice. What's with the discrepancy there?
Yeah, I think one of our opinion contributors at Chalkboard News from EdChoice, his name is Mike McShane. He wrote a piece basically saying, Republican or school choice leaning candidates, they are the ones who won big in the election, and he said in no small part because of their stance on school choice. And he used Texas as an example where school choice candidates backed by the governor there, they won. And so they probably will have enough to pass school choice in Texas. And so that's a big contentious issue in Texas. But more broadly, that shows that voters want school choice measures, even if you had some of these high profile defeats from constitutional amendments. And he just also sort of drew a line there and said, there are probably a lot of people who want to have school choice, but they might not want it, they don't want to mess with their state's constitution. So they might have qualms about that. So it's very interesting to see those kind of arguments, but basically saying that, these, Republican leaning or, these candidates who back school choice were very successful, sort of kind of flips the script on what we traditionally have seen in the media about, these school choice measures.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on these stories. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at chalkboardnews.com.